Coming to the very first topic of today's discussion, this is with respect to how to secure India's supply chain. West Asian conflict has primarily exposed India's vulnerabilities. Now, West Asia as a region, since time immemorial, it has been subjected to chaos, confusion and turmoil. But this present crisis involving Israel, US and Iran, it is affecting India's interest. Now, we all know that India as an economy, it's a heavily dependent economy as far as the oil needs are concerned. And much of our oil needs are sourced from the West Asian region. Over there, right now, what we are witnessing is that in the Strait of Hormuz region, we have the oil vessels and the vessels carrying the natural gas. They are being targeted. And it is inevitably affecting the supply of the oil and the natural gas in India. This has affected the price stability. It has led to the price spikes. It is affecting the overall macroeconomic growth. It is leading to inflationary pressures. And it is affecting the vulnerable sections the most. Therefore, a question arises that how can we make our supply chains more resilient and how can we strengthen them? We have a column which has been published in the Hindu by the president of the FICCI, who says that this is a time where India needs to substantially invest in strengthening and making the supply chains more resilient. Because we as a country, we as an economy, we are critically dependent on a few of the very important items. For example, the energy, as I told you, the oil and the natural gas. Or you talk about the food products, for example, the edible oils, we'll have a discussion. Or the pharma products. So this really calls for import substitution. This calls for strengthening the domestic manufacturing base. This calls for even other measures. So we'll have a discussion. Believe me, it's a very important topic which deals with the supply chains, strengthening the supply chains, very important topic of GS3, energy, infrastructure and development. What the author is trying to say is that supply chain resilience requires an integrated, forward-looking approach. Very, very important topic. But before we start, let's first talk what do we mean by supply chain. When we manufacture a product, different processes from end to end, from the very start, from that of the raw materials to the consumption of that particular service or product, the whole events, the supply chain has, that is basically termed as a part, integrated part of that particular supply chain. Let's look at this. By definition, it is a supply chain is the network of activities involved in producing and delivering a product or service to the end consumer. Now, there are various stages. Let's start with the suppliers. So we have suppliers of the raw materials and components. Then you have the sourcing, what you call this process as sourcing of the raw materials and the inputs. Then you have the manufacturing, which basically includes within its ambit the production and the assembly, right? What we call this stage as the production. Then we have the distribution, which primarily takes with the help of the warehousing and logistics, where you store your items which you have manufactured, right, which you have produced. And then you also include the transportation from one part A to part B, right? And then you have the retailers which focus on the sales and merchandising, sorry. And then that is a component of the overall sales. Finally, we have the end consumers, right? So this is the overall supply chain we are talking about. It's a very simplistic explanation of what supply chain comprises of. But in this particular article, we are focusing upon the global supply chain. Why? Because India's needs, especially with respect to some of the raw materials, they are closely integrated with the global supply chain. We source the materials from different countries around the world, and that is compromising our interest, right? So we have the raw materials or the other items which are then used for the manufacturing, right, to various suppliers. They are sent ultimately through shipping or air freight or warehousing. Warehousing is keeping or storing those products. We have the logistics phenomena which takes place. All these three things, including the packaging and the other things, the shipping, air freight and warehousing, they form a part of logistics. Remember that. Then we have the distribution and ultimately we have the retailers from one country to the other. This is the global supply chain we are talking about, right? So it includes the sourcing, then the production, then the distribution, delivery and the other thing, right? Now let's talk about that. What are the issues we are actually facing? So the debate is between the global interdependence and the vulnerability. Whenever we have seen such type of events, let's talk about the COVID times. And we'll talk about the examples and other things so that you develop a good clarity over the subject. over the topic, and also you can have more examples and facts to write in the examination. For example, in the COVID times, what we saw was that the world, prior to the COVID, the world was critically dependent on China with respect to various raw materials, for example, the active pharmaceutical ingredients which are used in the pharma industry or the electronic components. Then you had the COVID, and this led to a complete stop of the trade. And that compromised the interests of the other countries, primarily the European countries, including we had countries like India, right? Why? Because we were critically dependent on the imports from China. And then there was a sudden stop. So this led to the issues in the production capacity in India and the other countries around the world. So this inevitably affected the GDP growth in various countries around the world. Therefore, there was a talk of going for the economic decoupling. Economic decoupling, a very important word, which means to reduce our dependence on just one or two countries. Rather, the focus should be on diversifying our inputs. That is what you'll have to understand. That is economic decoupling. Right? Now, once we talk about India's import scenario, what you'll have to understand is that we are critically dependent on imports. Almost 19% of the overall amount of the GDP which we basically generate, that is basically utilized in the import aspect. For example, the energy imports, the food imports, the pharma imports, heavily dependent on the raw materials specifically. Raw materials I'm talking about with respect to the electronics. We are critically dependent on the semiconductors. We are critically dependent on the printed circuit boards. We are critically dependent on some of the very important components with respect to the electronics. We are dependent on the capital goods. What are capital goods? We'll talk about that. Capital goods are those high-end or high-performance machinery which are basically required, for example, for construction activities or, for example, for production, right, for manufacturing, and the intermediates. Now, there are the rising geopolitical risk, for example, what is happening in West Asia among the Israel, US and Iran, and specifically in the region of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, you have to tell me in the comments that Strait of Hormuz is a very important location, is between which country, right? You tell me the name of the countries between which you have the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this region, it almost amounts to almost 40% of the transport of India's needs with respect to oil and natural gas. So once we are witnessing that the region is now in a state of conflict, where you have the IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who are saying that we would make sure that we don't allow the passage of any of the vessels. So this is compromising the supplies in India. That is what we are trying to say. And these supply shocks ripple. They not just affect the supplies, rather they would also affect the inflation, the price spikes. We would witness the inflation. And inflation is something, the price spikes, the growth in the prices of the commodities and services. That is something which affects the vulnerable sections the most, the poor people, right? Rich people hardly, would feel the impact of inflation, but rather the low economic sections, those feel that. And it ultimately would compromise the economic growth, because once the price of the raw materials would increase, definitely you will see the final price of the consumer good or any service, that would also increase. And this would again lead to the low capacity of the people to buy, because see, the purchasing power of people is limited. And now you are raising the cost of goods and services. So what would happen is that it would lead to a slowdown in the overall growth. And that would affect the overall economic trajectory of the nation, the overall economic growth of the nation. That is what we are talking about, right? Ripple across various aspects. Now, if you talk about the sectoral analysis, if we talk about, because right now we are witnessing this issue in the energy aspect, but are there the other sectors where we are critically dependent? The answer is yes. And we'll have a complete discussion. We'll have a detailed discussion of which are the sectors which primarily suffer from this particular aspect. Let's talk about the energy security, a critical concern. There is high import dependence. With respect to crude oil, it's almost 80%, not 80%, in fact, more than that. We have a dependence of almost 85% as far as our crude oil needs are concerned. And as far as our natural gas needs are concerned, more than 50% is sourced from the other countries around the world. Now, just imagine a country like India, where we are having such a huge population, where we are on a developmental phase, where we are focusing upon the manufacturing, where we are seeing an increase in the transportation and everything. And this, along with this, what we are also witnessing is the price spikes or the supply shocks. So obviously, it would result in the overall, in the slowdown of the economy, right? High impact of price shocks, for example, an import bill. Now, the author in this particular article, he has talked about a scenario. What he says is that if there is a $10 increase in the price of the oil per barrel, if there is a $10 increase per barrel price of the crude oil, then that can have a devastating impact on the overall economic parameters. For example, once we talk about the import bill, that can rise by almost 12 to 13 billion dollars if there is just a $10 spike per barrel of the oil. Next is inflation. It can see 0.02 to 2.03% rise in the inflation, 20 to 30 basis points increase in the inflation. Then we have the GDP growth. This can also be lowered. It can be lowered by almost 0.2 to 0.3%. 0.2 to 0.3%. Because if the overall price increase, obviously what you will see is that the production capacity would be altered. As I told you, the purchasing power of the people is limited. And if the overall price of the goods and commodities increase in the market, people would not have the capacity to buy. And this would basically halt the production. Are you getting? So it has an effect, not just on the aspects, not just on one aspect, rather on different aspects of the economy. Then we have these strategic concerns. What are these strategic concerns? The very first is geographical dependence. Once we talk about the energy needs, what we often talk about is the single geography risk. What is the single geography risk? That we have diversified over the years, but still major portion of our imports of the oil and the gas needs comes from the West Asian region. And whenever there is an issue in the West Asian region, it can severely affect the supplies to India. And that is something which can also cause devastating impacts on the overall economic framework. That is what we are talking about. And this is known as single geography risk. This calls for greater diversification. Diversification, I mean to say that we should not just be dependent on one particular area. Rather, what we can do is we can source oil from different countries. And we did that. We were sourcing oil from Russia. But then US was against that. Because for US, Russia is an adversary. It asked India to basically stop the purchase of oil from Russia. The other alternatives, what it said was that you can buy from us, or you can buy from the Latin American countries, especially after US has captured the oil economy of Venezuela. So what we are trying to say is that there is a need for diversification. We cannot just have all the eggs in one basket, right? And exposure with regards to the supply side. That once we have limited supplies of these things now in India. What about what is going on with respect to the LPG crisis? We are witnessing the crisis with respect to the petroleum gas. We are witnessing crisis with respect to the natural gas. You just look, it is also leading to the hoarding. People are taking the advantage of the situation, some people. And that's the reason the government invoked the Essential Commodities Act in order to make sure that the supply, the manufacturing and the distribution of the LPG and the natural gas is controlled. And this also in one way or the other leads to black marketing. See, all these things are interlinked. And that is not good for any economy if you have black marketing. Because people, let's suppose you have a commercial gas cylinder. People would not have the access. We have seen the news that many of the restaurants in India have been shut down. Or many of the people, those small vendors on the roadside which you see, they don't have the capacity. They're saying that the price of the cylinders, the gas cylinders, it's doubled or even tripled. And if they would increase the price of the commodities they're selling, of the goods and services they are providing, obviously the people would not be inclined to buy that. Because most of the people who buy from the street vendors, they have low economic capacity. We don't see rich people in Mercedes coming and eating the street food. So that is something which you'll have to understand, right? Food security aspect. Now, next sectoral analysis can be of the food security. We often ignore this aspect because we feel that it's only the energy aspect which is compromised. No, we have the food security aspect also. We may be one of the largest producers of food in the world, but there are issues. Because what we have seen, and there are 2-3 things over here, especially with respect to the edible oils. There is high dependence on imports. Edible oils, palm oil is imported from Indonesia and Malaysia. Please make sure that you give importance to the examples which I'm telling you, because you can use these examples in your answers, right? Not everything. Analysis does not mean that I put each and everything over here. It means that you focus on the discussion and try to basically come up with these examples in your answers, right? Or facts. Indonesia and Malaysia. So we are heavily dependent on the palm oil imports from Indonesia and Malaysia. Let's talk about the soybean oil or the sunflower oil. It is imported from Argentina and Brazil, and also Russia, right? So these are some of the things. Pulses. Why we are witnessing a great surge in the imports of pulses? There are 2-3 reasons. The very first is that our purchasing power, on an average, the purchasing power of Indians is increasing. Once you see the increase in the purchasing power, people have a tendency to go for good foods, a protein-rich food. So their dependence on the carbohydrates generally reduces, and the dependence on the pulses, on the protein, high protein diet increases. And therefore, what we are witnessing is that as the purchasing power is increasing, people are consuming more of the pulses. We are one of the largest producers of pulses, there's no doubt regarding that. But we are also importing good amounts of pulses. And over the years, that is continuously increasing. And just before a few days, we had the Chief Justice of India, who basically said that, asked the government to constitute a committee and to make sure that you diversify the agricultural crops. Because right now what we are witnessing is, according to the Chief Justice of India, there is a rice wheat intensive system. We are just focusing upon the rice and the wheat because there is the assured minimum support price. We also have for some of the pulses. But the MSP, what the Chief Justice said, the MSP for the pulses is not enough to compensate for the cost of cultivating pulses. So you'll have to increase the MSP, the overall MSP of the pulses. So there is a need for a diversification. What he said, that you need to provide the incentives to the farmers so that they basically switch from the rice and wheat to the pulses. And that would obviously also improve the overall nutritional status. And fertilizers. Let's talk about the fertilizers. Once we talk about the potash, once we talk about the ammonium, diammonium phosphate, DAP, and for potash we have the muriate of potash, MOP and diammonium phosphate. We are critically dependent on the imports of these two fertilizers. Primarily it is sourced from Oman, then we have Saudi Arabia, we have Russia, we have Morocco. These are the countries from where we import these fertilizers. And India is one of the largest consumers of fertilizers. So obviously there is also a cost which the government bears. So this is what you'll have to understand. Domestic oilseed production, it only caters to 44% of the domestic needs. And almost 55% of the needs, it is imported. As I gave you the example, the palm oil from Indonesia, Malaysia, and the others, right? What are the risks involved? The very first is the inflation. See, understand, as I told you, that we have this muriate of potash and diammonium phosphate. It is primarily sourced from Oman, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, all these regions in the North African part or the West Asian part. Again, the supply of these fertilizers would also be affected. That is what you'll have to understand, right? Inflation would lead to inflation and rural distress, because ultimately it is going to be the low economic capacity section. That section of the society which has low economic capacity, low purchasing power, it is going to affect them the most. And it can also lead to malnutrition. Why? Because if the prices of the edible oils or the pulses, specifically pulses, would increase, people would not have the capacity to buy, especially the poor people. And therefore, this would reduce the protein intake in the body. More of carbohydrates would be then, consumed. So this would lead to a kind of increasing malnutrition, right? Now, let's talk about the next aspect, next sectoral analysis, which is the manufacturing aspect. In the manufacturing sector, definitely India has done wonders as far as manufacturing capacity is concerned. What we could not do in the years after 2000, we have done in the last 10-15 years. But again, there are issues. There are serious issues, especially with the coming of the emerging technologies. or the new technologies, right? Because the needs are different now. Once we talk about the manufacturing and industrial supply chain risk, the very first is the import structure. With respect to the raw materials and the intermediates, with respect to the overall manufacturing we are talking, almost one-third dependency is there on the imports. Almost one-third of the raw materials and the intermediates are still sourced from outside the country. Once we talk about the capital goods, there is the requirement of the import is almost one-fourth, 25%. Capital goods. Capital goods are those items, those machineries, high-end machineries or high-performance machineries, which are used in manufacturing. You can imagine, you can just think about big machines used in construction. So we are still dependent on these machines, specifically from China, right? Then we have consumer goods, the end products which we use. Almost 12% dependency is there on the imports. So what this picture shows, that still we are critically dependent on the very basic raw materials or the intermediates or the capital goods or the consumer goods. So this is a warning sign. Critical dependencies are there with respect to strategic minerals. As I told you, that we are witnessing a surge in emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and this is the future. If we don't invest adequately in these areas, we'll be left out, and that we can't afford. And once we talk about the electronics, for example, in electronics manufacturing, we have different components. We have the requirement of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, copper, tin, antimony, bismuth, platinum. So all these are the critical components of any electronics. And almost 90% of them are imported to India. Because we don't have the adequate capacity. We may have the reserves. There's no denial to that fact. But what about the exploration? Are we investing enough on the exploration part? Are we investing enough on the production part and the refining? And I'll give you data. Almost 70% of the global production of these critical minerals and rare earth elements, it is in China, almost 80%. And almost from 70 to 75%, the production is in China. And almost the refining capacity, the refining of these ores to get the minerals, almost 85% is in China. Of the world, can you imagine? And that is the reason US came with the MSP, Mineral Security Partnership. India also became a member of that, so as to diversify and strengthen the supply chains with respect to critical minerals. So this is one of the very important issues, and China can use this as a strategic tool. It has done so in the case of US-China tensions, where it limited the supply, it limited the exports of critical minerals to US. So this is what you'll have to understand. Sectoral dependencies. Let's talk about the pharmaceuticals. You must have heard about the APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, the very base of the medicines, specifically the generic medicines. India is known as the supplier, the factory of generic medicines in the world. We supply to African countries. But what is the basic raw material? It is the active pharmaceutical ingredients. Almost 70% of the APIs are still imported from China. So that is one of the very important issues. Then we have the electronics, electronic components, printed circuit boards, light emitting diodes, so many things. Many of these are imported from the East Asian economies. Vietnam, then we have the other countries, Thailand. Then we have the capital goods. Again, we are critically dependent on China as far as the capital goods are concerned. Or let's talk about, once we talk about the electronics, or let's talk about the semiconductors. Though we have started with the National Semiconductor Mission, in this year's budget, we are also focusing upon the National Semiconductor Mission 2.0, where we'll not just focus on the assembly. Rather, we'll have a full stack approach. A full stack approach means that we will also focus upon the aspects of coming up with various manufacturing abilities of the semiconductors from end to end. Because previously, we just focused on the ATMP, assembly, testing, marking and packaging. Assembly, testing, marking and packaging of the semiconductors. Now we'll focus upon the full stack development from end to end. That is what we are talking about. What has the government done? What have been the steps which have already been taken? The very first is that the government has come up with the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, in line with the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement. Nationally determined contributions mean these are the voluntary targets which the country takes. Just before a few days, we have updated the NDCs, where we say that we want to really come up with those steps which are sustainable in nature, which can reduce the ill effects of anthropogenic climate change. Anthropogenic climate change means the human-induced ill effects on climate change. For example, we have said that we would reduce the emission intensity of GDP by 45% by 2030 if we compare with the base year as 2005. Then we have also said that we would be focusing upon increasing the carbon sinks to the tune of almost 2.5 to 3 billion tons. I'm talking about the NDCs which the government submitted in 2022. You can also look at the updated NDCs. These are also valid, right? Then we also said that we are going to focus on having at least 500 gigawatts of the renewable energy capacity as far as the electricity is concerned. So these were some of the targets which we have taken. So this, in one way, what it means is that we would lower down our dependencies on the fossil fuels, including the oil. Okay. Next is the green hydrogen mission. To make sure that, see, we have different industries, and there are certain industries which are energy intensive, which require heavy energy, fire needs, heating needs, in hard to abate sectors, those sectors which are critically dependent upon the coal or the other energy mechanisms for heating and other things. We would make sure that we supply the energy with respect to hydrogen. And that's the reason we have come with the green hydrogen mission, right? Then we have domestic exploration of oil and natural gas. This is very, very important. We'll start with 2016. In 2016, the government came up with the HELP policy, hydrocarbons exploration and licensing policy. This included the open acreage policy and the other elements. In just the end of the last year, the government came up with the Oil Regulation and Development Act. The overall objective was to increase the investor confidence in the exploration of oil and gas, and to also focus upon the ease of doing business in the oil and gas sector, right? Then we have the mission for Atmanirbharta in pulses. Very recent. Prime Minister came up with this. And the government also realizes that what we are witnessing, there are 2-3 things. First, we are having a rice intensive system. Some regions which are better suited for the cultivation of pulses, they are basically cultivating the rice, more of water needs, and it is compromising the soil stability, the quality of the soil. And along with that, what we are also witnessing is that there is increase in the purchasing power and also increase in the pulses consumption. But we don't have the required cultivation, though we are one of the largest producers of pulses in the world. But the consumption is more. Therefore, we are critically dependent. And this particular scheme of the government, this mission, focuses upon making sure that we develop Atmanirbharta, self-reliance in the pulses, right? Then we have the National Critical Minerals Mission. Again, the very objective is to focus upon the exploration, the production, the refining of the critical minerals using the activities by Geological Survey of India or the other mechanisms. Then we have the PLI schemes, production-linked incentive schemes, in order to focus upon certain sectors like electronics, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, to incentivize the producers, the manufacturers, that whatever incremental production you would have, we would incentivize on that. You increase from 100 to 120, these 20 products which you have increased, we will incentivize you on that PLI scheme. So these are the steps which have been taken. But there are challenges. There are serious issues, and we'll have to focus on that. What are the issues? The very first is upstream weakness. देखो, पूरी supply chain में, in the whole supply chain, you have the upstream, you have the midstream, and then you have the downstream. Upstream matlab, say focusing upon sourcing of the raw materials, then you have the midstream, the production and everything, and then you have the downstream. Downstream primarily refers to the assembly and packaging and other things. We are very good as far as downstream is concerned, the assembly and packaging and transportation. But there are issues with respect to upstream and midstream. We don't have the adequate production capacity with respect to different goods and commodities. So we need to focus upon the production aspect. That is what we are talking about. Assembly versus manufacturing. We are very good as far as the assembly of different. Assembly means what? That you have the components. Now you're just placing the components together. You have not produced the components. And if you see, especially the high-end products, for example, of Apple or other things, you would see that it's written over there, designed in California and assembled in China or assembled in Vietnam. If Vietnam as a country can do that, why can't India? And we are not just focusing upon the assembly. Why not we focus upon having our own intellectual property? We'll just read that. Coming up with the process innovation. And then coming up with our own products, which compete not just domestically, but also internationally. So, ये बहुत important है, right? Import concentration risk. For example, with respect to active pharmaceutical ingredients from China, oil from the West Asian countries, electronics from the East Asian economies, we have this critical dependence, import concentration. Then let's talk about the infrastructure gaps. By India, we came up with the SEZs, special economic zones. Uske baad the government came up with the NIMZ, National Investment and Manufacturing Zones. What is the status of these? Crores of rupees were spent. But still what we are seeing is there is not that much of production in these areas, special economic zones or NIMZ. So we'll have to focus on making sure that we develop robust industrial clusters. What do we mean by industrial clusters? Those areas where you have where you have different facilities which are already provided by the government. And various industries come in that area. And this, already providing services initially. Electricity and the other processes, that is known as plug and play model. Plug and play model. So you can write these in your way forward. That the government should focus on providing the plug and play model for various industries so that we can have a robust and a healthy development of industrial clusters, right? Then storage. We don't have the adequate capacity of storage. Storage ki baat kare, so we are not just talking about the energy, the oil. Let's talk about the storage of pulses. Millions of tons of wheat and rice is wasted in the storage capacities of Food Corporation of India or Central Warehousing Corporation. Why is that so? On one hand, we have the hunger. On the other hand, we have huge wastage of these food commodities. This is a paradox, right? Because we don't have adequate capacity of storing, right? Then we have logistics. Logistics means you have the transport, packaging, all these elements in the whole supply chain. We came up with the National Logistics Policy, NLP. NLP mein kya tha? That it was released by the Ministry of Commerce, where it said that we'll focus on each and every element of the logistics. And we'll make sure that we reduce the logistics costs to almost 8% of GDP. Right now, we have almost 13 to 14% of GDP is the logistics cost. So, you have the cost of the product. In addition, you are having so much of the logistics cost. That is not something which is acceptable, right? So we'll have to reduce that because most of the European countries, they have the logistics cost of around 8%. Then we have the technological deficit. We have already discussed in one of the analyst sessions that we have very low research and development investment, just 0.65% of GDP. Countries like China, they're investing almost 2.5% of GDP. Kyun important hai? Why it is important R&D? Because once you will have a robust ecosystem for research and development, that would lead to more of the process innovation, more of intellectual property, more of patents for various machines or technologies that can be commercialized. You can commercialize that process innovation. And then you would have more advantage as compared to the others. Why US has become dominant? Because it's a technology leader. China through reverse engineering has done that. So we should also focus upon increasing the R&D. Weak in intellectual property regime. We are seeing increase in the registrations of domestic patents. There's no denial to that fact. But what about the patents with respect to the global aspect? There are very less number of patents, even lesser than the country like Switzerland. So we'll have to focus on that. Low domestic value addition. We are just focusing on the assembly, not on the value addition. That is what you'll have to understand. Economic impact of price shocks. Again, once you will have these things, that is again going to have effect as far as the overall supply of goods is concerned. We are witnessing a crunch in the LPG, and that is affecting the lowest economic sections the most. Then let's talk about the policy fragmentation. We are having different schemes, definitely. But there is an issue. We don't follow an ecosystem approach. We have a fragmented approach where different ministries are coming up with various schemes. But there is lack of coordination. Coordination ही नहीं है. We have Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. Then we have Ministry of Power. We have Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. How to integrate, how to coordinate among these three ministries if the government wants to come up with a particular scheme which incentivizes the production of solar modules? जरूरत है ना तीनों का coordination की. But that is not possible. That is not there. Coordination is there, but not to that level. There is fragmentation in coordination, right? What should be the way forward? The very first is build domestic manufacturing ecosystems. पहले से we'll have to focus on the full stack. We can't just be reliant on the assembly. That is not going to help because even countries like Thailand, Vietnam, the East Asian, Southeast Asian economies, they have done that. If those countries can do, we are not talking about Japan or Korea, South Korea. We are talking about these countries. Take, for example, Bangladesh. Bangladesh has done wonders as far as the apparel and textile industry is concerned. So if a country like Bangladesh can do so, we can 100%, right? So we have to focus on a shift from the assembly to that of full the value chain integration. Full value chain, starting from the raw materials. If we don't have the raw materials, we'll have to diversify the sources. But again, we have to try on having focus on the exploration and production of our own raw materials, right? And we have the ores, we have the mine clusters, focus sectors in certain areas, for example, in APIs, for example, in electronics. We have done a lot of work. We have one of the largest smartphone manufacturing plant is in Noida, right? So we have to focus more upon the electronics, semiconductors and other things, semiconductors, right? Then we have a diversification strategy. We'll have to diverse. We'll have to make sure that we are not critically dependent on one particular geography. For example, from Latin America or South or let's say the African countries, source the critical minerals from African countries. Tell me, what is a lithium triangle? The countries which form a part of lithium triangle. Do answer in the comments, right? So that others can also learn who don't know, right? Oil diversification. We must follow our national interests and we must increase the imports from Russia, or not just Russia, from other countries around the world. We cannot be just critically dependent on West Asian countries. Strategic reserves and buffering. We have the strategic petroleum reserves. We have these strategic petroleum reserves where the petroleum is stored, and it is also one thing really worth appreciating that India has a stock of almost 75 days as far as the crude oil is concerned. And this is because of we have a strategic petroleum reserves to the tune of almost 5.4 million metric tons in Visakhapatnam, in Padur, and in Mangaluru. Visakhapatnam, Padur, and Mangaluru. Three areas where we have the underground areas where the crude oil is stored. So we need to expand that. That is very, very important. Similarly, for food and grains, we have the capacity, but we don't have the adequate systems in place. We'll have to make sure that the food is not wasted, right? Be it the Food Corporation of India or the other organizations. Smooth and quick energy transition is very, very important. We'll have to focus upon the grid integration. On one hand, we have the power supply sources from the conventional aspects, the thermal energy. On the other hand, we have the solar energy, the wind energy. But there are issues with respect to grid integration because there are fluctuations. The power supply is intermittent. Use these words. Again, I'm saying these are very important. Because once you see a surge in the overall sun rays in the afternoon, you see a high capacity generation with respect to solar energy. But then there is a tapering which takes place. So you'll have to integrate these two sources. Grid integration is very important. Focus on the technologies which can smoothen the grid integration. Then we have the battery storage systems. Ye bahut important, and we'll study today in the simplified, in the prelims pointer section, we'll talk about the PM Kusum 2.0, where the government would now focus upon the battery storage systems. Bhai, wo hum systems leke aaye to bring those systems where we can store the energy which is generated and later we can use it in those part of the day where we don't have the supply from the renewable energy sources. Strengthen trade and supply chain alliances. Let's talk about the supply chain resilience initiative, between Australia, Japan, India. Post-COVID, we came with that. So we can come up with the Quad, we can come up with the new schemes, right? New areas. We had the IMEC, India Middle East Economic Corridor, but the future is in a state of crisis, is in doldrums. We don't know what is going to happen. Then we have the FTAs. This is something which is really good. We have come into FTAs with different countries around the world, with UAE. Recently, we have also come in a trade deal with the EU, what we call as a mother of all trade deals. So we'll have to focus upon these FTAs, very, very important. Then boost R&D and innovation. As I told you that, first of all, we have a very small amount of portion which we are giving to the research and development, and most of it is the government which is doing so. We see very less of private investment. And in countries like China or even US, take for example US, most of the investment which is done in the R&D, it is by the private sectors. That's why you have these companies like Apple and Microsoft and Google, whose overall market capitalization is more than the GDP of almost 70 countries combined. Nvidia, it has crossed the overall, the market capitalization of Nvidia. It is much more than that of the GDP of India. Why? Because over there, these enterprises have focused upon the research and development, right? Policy reforms. What are the measures which are needed? The very first is logistics. Karna padega. You'll have to focus on the logistics areas. You'll have to make sure that that you focus enough on making it easy for the transporters to take their products from one point to the other. We have come up with the e-way bill. We have come up with the GST. We have come up with the fast tags. We have tried to strengthen and make the national highways more broad. The capacity is increased. So definitely we'll have to focus on the logistics aspect, the packaging and the customs requirement, custom clearances, all have to be incorporated in that. Then we have ease of doing business reforms. Because if you'll not focus on that, we have seen significant improvement in ease of doing business. But specifically in certain states, there are issues. So if you have issues with respect to registration of property or electricity supply, why would you see the inflow of foreign investors in India? Investment would be reduced. So you'll have to focus on these areas. So what we are trying to say is that we have to, in order to really become self-reliant, by words we don't become self-reliant. We don't become self-reliant by repeating that we are Atmanirbhar Bharat. No. We are critically dependent on some of the most important needs, and we'll have to focus on those areas. That is what you'll have to understand. And only then we can basically become developed, Viksit Bharat by 2047. If we are critically dependent on these countries around the world, that is a question mark on the sovereignty. Because let's talk about the energy sovereignty or technological sovereignty. So we'll have to focus on different ways and means. We have talked about what are the measures required. Only then we'll realize a vision of Viksit Bharat by 2047. All right, let's have a means practice question. We had a daily discussion. I really want you all to write an answer on this because this is a very, very important area. The question is, discuss the nature of India's supply chain vulnerabilities in various sectors and suggest measures required to build a resilient and self-reliant manufacturing ecosystem. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write the answer, and yes, if you're liking the initiative, do not forget to press the like button and also let us know in the comments. Let's go to the next topic.